Hello, we're very excited today to present the new automated app deployment solution that has been added to PowerBuilder 2019 R3. Normally when we get to a third revision of a major release, there's really no exciting features, minor enhancements, bug fixes, and typically you're looking at a long-term support when you get to the third revision of a major release. But Appeon has went ahead and added a really exciting new feature called PowerClient. And PowerClient is a new feature of R3 that is to simplify on-premise app deployment. Why we say on-premise? Because this is targeted to client-server applications, and typically client-server applications are deployed on-premise. Now, this solution is automatic, meaning no code changes, and basically configuration is all that's required. But before we go and talk more about PowerClient, let's take a brief overview of the key new features Appeon has added to PowerBuilder 2019 R3. So besides the PowerClient, we have done some IDE enhancements. Enhancing the PowerScript IDE is definitely on Appeon's roadmap, and we have been enhancing it in previous versions, and R3 is no exception. We've actually done something pretty spectacular, which is decoupling the IDE and the runtime. What that means is that the IDE and the PowerBuilder runtime no longer have to be on the same version. Also, we've done enhancements to Git and SVN, and we've listened to our customers and enhanced the license mechanism so that on the same machine, you can simultaneously use multiple versions of PowerBuilder. For example, let's say you're maintaining an app in PowerBuilder 2019 R3, and then you also want to do some development or testing with PowerBuilder 2021, for example. We've also done visual enhancements. The Chromium web browser control, which was added to PowerBuilder 2019 revision 2, has been enhanced greatly. Now you can interact with the JavaScript that is contained within the web browser control. 64-bit is another thing that's really on Appeon's roadmap, and so what we've been doing is now enhancing the rich text edit so that it also supports 64-bit, not just 32-bit. As well as we got a newer version of the TX text control, which includes fixes, and in the future, we'll be able to incorporate actually new rich text control features. Accessibility is also very important for some of our customers, and so we have put focus in revision 3 to enhance accessibility. Specifically, we've switched over to Microsoft's newer UI automation framework, and that allows PowerBuilder to be much more accessible than before. We also included a new SQL Server driver, the OLADB driver. This is not to be confused with the old OLADB. This is entirely new. It's actually using a native interface, and this is what Microsoft recommends to use in place of the SQL native client, which Microsoft has deprecated some years ago. And also, R3 is a long-term support version. Long-term support versions are typically eligible support for at least 5 years, and sometimes longer, depending on our product roadmap, release cycle, and customer situation. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of the new features in R3. It's just giving you a bird's eye view of some of the highlights. So we definitely encourage you to take a good look at R3 because we put a lot of work in the last several months to make this revision. Now, without further ado, let's resume talking about PowerClient. Brief overview. This is a deployment solution for client-server applications. It's included free with PowerBuilder 2019 R3 version and newer, as long as you're on the Professional or Cloud Pro subscriptions. If you're on Standard, you will need to upgrade or request a trial. Now, why we went ahead and developed PowerClient? Because we know that deploying and updating client-server applications has a lot of headaches, very labor-intensive, and costs, distraction, and so on. And we want to eliminate that. We also want to eliminate the headaches and costs of having to create your own installation program and routine to install the application and install various DLLs, OCXs, or other things that your application uses. And lastly, we know that as Power developers, we've been spoiled by productivity. So when we designed our solution, we made sure that you didn't have to do any sort of significant code change or any significant effort. I mean, basically, you just configure your project, and obviously you would need to have a web server configured because the files are downloaded from a web server, and just deploy. And we'll be talking a little more about this whole deployment architecture in just a minute. But let's review some of the key features or capabilities of the PowerClient. So as mentioned already, this is an automated app deployment solution for on-premise or client-server applications. Now, what's really nice is it incrementally updates. We've refactored how PBDs work, and now you'll be able to incrementally update your app to users at an individual object level. So let's say in a Pibble, you have one window object that has changed or one data window object that has been changed. PowerClient will push just that modified window or just that modified data window to your users. And also, it eliminates the need to have to create your own installation program or setup program, because besides deploying the PowerBuilder application, it will also package and deploy all the necessary files your app needs. For example, like PB virtual machine, the runtime. Let's say your app uses PBRs, let's say uses OCXs or DLLs, INI file, and so on. Images, you can package anything that you would typically need with a PowerBuilder application. Now, it supports 100% of PowerBuilder features, so you don't have to go and refactor any code or debug something. It's using the same PowerBuilder virtual machine that you use today for traditional client-server app deployment. So we're not changing the architecture of your app. We're not changing how the app works. We're just changing how the app installs. That's all. And you can deploy with PowerClient both 32-bit and 64-bit projects. So there's no limitations in that regards. Now, from the IDE, when you compile your project, there's a couple options on how you get this deployed to the users. It's always going to go to a HTTP or web server, which is essentially acting as a file server, but you can directly FTP from the PowerBuilder IDE to that web server that is going to then push the app to the users, or you could create a standalone package of your application, which then you pass, for example, to an IT administrator that has access to the production environment, and they're the ones that then install it. So it's very flexible in how you deploy. And just to remind you, the system requirements on the client side are exactly the same as traditional PowerBuilder client-server projects. So basically, at this point with 2019, Windows 7 and earlier end of life. So you're basically looking at Windows 10 only. And just remind you, Windows 10 is available on a variety of devices, not just a desktop or laptop, but also Surface tablets, for example. All right, so now let's contrast how client-server apps are typically deployed today to how PowerClient will deploy them. So what you're looking at is a typical client-server architecture. You have your database, you have all your users, they have database drivers on their machine, and the apps are directly talking to the database over TCP/IP. Typically, these are on-premise. You don't have to, but generally it's a security risk to expose a database over an internet connection. So typically, these will be inside of a firewall or on-premise deploy. Now, as a developer, you'd be developing in PowerBuilder, right? You compile your application, you create a setup program or some way for the app to install, and then you're distributing it out to each of your users one by one. And then it has to be manually installed, right? Each user is manually installing this. Some companies invest to try to automate this on their own. You know, PowerClient didn't exist before R3, so some customers found this so painful, they've gone creative with it. But it's always better to take something that Appian is providing you native in PowerBuilder instead of trying to use a workaround. So in this case, now that we have this native solution, we can eliminate this distribution and installation headaches. Now, every time you make a change to your PowerBuilder application, you do this all over again. You've gone through this before. And if you're very agile, developing frequently, then this becomes a nightmare. So in a way, the deployment headaches of client-server applications are holding us off from being more agile, of pumping out things faster, because it's just such a hassle. So let's contrast this to PowerClient. PowerClient is a deployment option. It's not a different architecture for the application. So if you take a look at the runtime, it's exactly the same as before. It's a client-server app. You have multiple users. Each one has an app on their machine with database driver that's making TCP/IP connection. Again, this would be within the firewall, typically on-premise. Now, as a developer, you're still coding in PowerBuilder exactly the same way as you did before. There's nothing different about how you develop the application. It's really just how you configure your project. So you'll be configuring, compiling, and those configurations tell it how to package your app and deploy that to a web server. Now, there's no special requirement for the web server because the web server is simply acting as a file server. It's not executing any logic or for example, data access, SQL, PowerScript. None of that is executing on the web server. Okay, so the web server is just a means to distribute the app files to the user and push updates of those app files to the user. So for that reason, the web server can be anything. You can use Apache IIS. There's no special requirement. And oftentimes, you would put this web server simply on-premise wherever your database is. That'd be logical. But there's no reason why the web server couldn't be hosted over the internet or over the cloud. But just keep in mind, the applications are not transformed into cloud apps. These apps are still directly communicating with the database over TCP/IP. So the web server will take care of pushing out the apps to the users. All the user needs is simply a URL, put it in a browser, and the app is going to come down. And once the app has come down, there can be options to create a shortcut on the desktop or the start menu, and the user would simply click that shortcut. That shortcut contains a URL to the web server, and each time the app starts, it's going to check the web server to see if you updated your application. If you've redeployed your app, it'll try to incrementally bring down the changes. And this process is, again, incremental, and that's how you repeat it. You simply modify a window or data window, redeploy the incremental updates to the web server, and then those updates incrementally get pushed to the user the next time the user starts the application. All right, so let's talk about the difference between PowerClient and PowerServer. I've heard some confusion from some of our customers and just want to briefly outline these two solutions. PowerClient is a client-server architecture, as we've been talking about in the previous diagram. So what does that mean? Data access executes on the client side. The client calls the database directly. You need a web server. There's no special requirement for application logic or .NET framework or anything like that on the server. And there's zero conversion work because we're not changing the architecture of the application at all. Now, PowerServer is a solution not just to solve the deployment problem that PowerClient solves, but it also changes your app to a cloud-native architecture so you can deploy your applications and use your applications over the internet. So a lot of times when people need remote access in the old days, they would use Citrix terminal services. But with a cloud-native solution, why use a workaround like Citrix or terminal services? The PowerServer is much lower cost than Citrix, much more scalable, and doesn't have a lot of the headaches and issues associated with something like Citrix because it's a real cloud-native architecture. It's not a client-server application running hundreds or thousands of times on a single machine server. So with a cloud-native architecture, unlike the PowerClient, the data access executes on the server side. The client side does not directly talk to database, does not need database drivers. It simply makes REST API calls over HTTPS to the .NET server. So yes, there is requirement on the server side. It's executing C#, it's executing embedded SQL, it's executing data windows. So you do need a .NET server, and PowerServer, the latest version coming, version 2021, is switching over from the old .NET framework to the .NET Core 3.x. And what's nice about .NET Core 3.x is that's the future. That's where Microsoft is moving. They're discontinuing the old .NET. Another nice thing at the .NET Core is that it's cross-OS, so you no longer have to run your .NET server on a Windows operating system if you don't want to. You could use Linux, for example. And another great thing to point about .NET Core is, unlike the older versions of .NET, this is completely open source. So you don't need to worry that something's going to stop with the technology and then you're going to hit a dead end with your projects. Now, since the architecture is different, there is some conversion work, but typically this is weeks because the upcoming PowerServer 2021 supports 100% of PowerBuilder features. You're not having unsupported features per se, but there's some conversion work to deal with how the communication is now over REST APIs and returning JSON. Some of the things you're going to need to do is secure those REST APIs. By default, we're not going to add tokens or anything like that. So for development, you'll be able to run it maybe without much work, but to go into production, you would want to secure your APIs. So whether to go with PowerClient or PowerServer really depends on if your application needs remote access or internet access. If you're fine with client-server application and just want to get rid of deployment headaches, PowerClient is a great solution, and it's going to be less work than PowerServer. So if you don't need that internet access, then there's no reason to go with PowerServer. So in terms of next steps, you can try out a beta version of PowerClient today. If you're already a subscriber of Professional or Cloud Pro, then you simply go to appeon.com and on the right-hand corner, click the download section, and you'll be able to download the beta version and take it for a test drive. And as I said, since you don't need to do code changes, simply configure and go, you should be up and running in one day. Now, if you're on a standard edition or you're not currently a Appeon customer, you can request special access to the beta version by emailing trial@appeon.com. We also strongly encourage you to attend Elevate 2020. Elevate 2020 is an online conference. You don't need to travel anywhere. It's COVID-free, and it's on November 16 and 17. It's 100% free, and you can easily register online. Just go to elevate.appeon.com. Elevate 2020 is a great place to learn more deeply about PowerClient, how to effectively use it, gotchas, things like that. But not just PowerClient, all the other features of R3, as well as features we've added in R2 and earlier versions. It's really a good educational conference. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Govinda, our technical guru, and he's going to take you through a demonstration and a brief tutorial of how PowerClient can automate and simplify deploying and updating your client-server applications.
Thank you, Ramin. Hi, everybody. I'm Govinda Lopez, and in this webinar, I'll be showing you the new PowerClient feature available in PowerBuilder 2019 R3. So, without any further ado, I'll start by showing you the installer. In this release, I will be installing 3 different components: the PowerBuilder IDE and runtime on the development machine, the PowerClient app publisher on the web server, and the PowerClient launcher on the client computer. So we will take a look at each one of the components in this webinar. Now, the PowerClient app publisher is used to distribute my PowerClient client-server apps to the end user, while the PowerClient launcher will be automatically downloaded and installed on the client computer. So let's open now the IDE. As you can see here, I'm currently running this build. So if you would like to test it out too, please remember that you need the Professional or Cloud Pro editions. If you have a standard edition subscription, you would need to upgrade in order to try out this cool new feature. Now I'll show you this demo app running. As you can see, this app has some windows in it, and let's show you this data windows right here, some drop down data windows, some more detailed data windows. Here's another window, filtering, and we also have some reports right here. Let's run it. And there you go. And it actually looks this modern because I am using the new ribbon bar control and UI themes features. I'm also consuming RESTful web services from this server. But now let's see how we can actually deploy this app using PowerClient. So what I'll do is click on New, click on the Project tab, then select the PowerClient Client Server App option, and click OK. As you can see, this is similar to the traditional client-server project with some differences. So I will name my app. In this case, I'll name it Demo R3. Now we have two deployment options, incremental and full. I want to go for full deployment and 32 for this demo. So here I can decide where I want to deploy my app to. I have a local server deployment and a remote server deployment. So we are also able to generate an installable package for the web server deployment. That way you can just copy the package and install it directly into your web server without the IDE connecting to it. I'm currently using an earlier release, so I'm not able to show it to you here, but it is already in the final release. So let's start with the local server deployment. For this type of deployment, you need to start PowerBuilder as an administrator. And the reason for this is that I will be deploying to a local IIS installation. And this requires an administrator account to save the deployment files. So my web server IIS has previously been configured. It has to be configured before deploying. I will now make sure that my web service root folder has the appropriate permissions. Let's take a look. This folder has to have the IISI users user with all the necessary permissions. So I've already done that. If you haven't, don't forget to add it. Now let's go back to PowerBuilder. Let's configure the local server deployment. Here, I'll add my web root path. Since I'm using IIS, this is the root path I'll put in place. But if it were any other web server, I'll need to place the root path here. So let's test the connection. This means that I have actually been able to connect to the web root path. It is not checking if the web server is running, only if it can deploy the files to the web root folder. Let's now look into the remote server configuration. The remote server deployment is done through FTP. So the FTP service should have already been installed and running on the remote server. The FTP account that I'll use needs to be pointing to the root folder of my web server as well. And in this case, I'll connect to this server IP address. It's using this port and with this credentials. I can also securely connect to my FTP server by ticking this checkbox here. So let's test the connection. And again, this is only checking the FTP connection, not that the web server is running. So let's move on to the next tab, the external files tab. This is where I will add any external files I want to be deployed with my application. So as you can see, we have two options, packages and files. The first option allows me to package into a compressed archive my files. This is very useful if you want to deploy a large amount of files while saving some bandwidth. Of course, you could just distribute your files as individual non-packaged files, which can be done here. But let me show you how I will create a new package of my files. So click here on the Create Package button. Then give a name to the package. which in this case I'll name this one resources. Then click OK. I can add individual files by clicking the Add Files button, or I can add whole folders here on the Add Folder button. So let's add a folder. I'll select the resources folder and then click on Add. Notice how this places the folder and the files in it here. These files are necessary for my application to run on the client side. In fact, any PB application requires this specific files to run, so don't forget to add them. My application uses images, so I'll add a new package for the images. Oh, here we go. I'll name it images. Add a folder. Here it is. Now, remember that my app uses the UI themes? Well, we need to add the themes folder. So let's create another package for the themes. Create package, name it, add the folder. But wait, I have other additional files to add. Remember how I'm using the ribbon bar control? Well, for this particular app, I have a file to deploy for it, along with some other additional files too. So I'll just add them to the existing resources package. So my INI files, my HTML files, and any other files necessary would be selected in this step. Now, if I had any additional DLLs that I needed to be registered automatically, I can click on the DLL and OCX registration button. So let's do that. And here is where I would select the files I would like to be automatically registered. But for this particular app, I don't need to register any, so I can leave them unchecked. So I can now go to the Runtime tab. Here is where I would select the runtime version I want my app to run on. I can also select all the runtime modules I want to include with my deployment. So for this specific app, I won't need all of them. So I'll remove the ones that I don't need. For example, ADO.NET, Informix, JDBC, ODBC, Oracle, SAP. I won't need this. Excel, PBDOM, text control, XML support, OData, and web services. So why am I leaving this database drivers? Well, it's important to note here that PowerClient is still a client-server approach. But if you want to deploy to the cloud instead of client-server architecture, then you should use PowerServer instead of PowerClient. And finally, we can move on to the Preload Event tab. Here, I can place any batch commands I need to execute after the app downloads, but before the app starts. So here's an example of something you could add. I'm actually adding a cd command here and a regsam command too. And I can also have these commands run as an administrator here if it's required. But for this app, I actually don't need to execute any batch commands before my app starts, so I'll remove them from here. I can now save my project. I'll give it a name, pdemo r3 client server. Save it. Now let's go ahead and deploy it. So all I need to do is click on the Deploy PowerClient Client Server App button here. And let's just give it a second for it to finish. Now that it has finished, let's go see what actually got deployed. So I'll open my web root folder. See this folder? That's the application that I just deployed to my web server. So let's open it. Inside of it, you will see that I have my deployment files as well as my libraries converted into folders. My application had 7 pebbles, and they have been compiled into 7 PBD folders. We deploy this as PBD folders because PowerClient PBD folders are different than traditional PBDs. If you open up a folder rather than a single monolithic PBD file, the PBD has been broken down by each object that is in the pebble. For example, each window object, each function, each data window. This allows PowerClient to incrementally update to the user at an object level rather than at a PBD file. Remember that these files are on the web server. So now let's take a look at how a final user would actually run the app. I'll open my browser window. I'll type in the address of my server along with the name of my app. Okay, so this will actually prompt me to download the third component, which is the PowerClient launcher. Now there are 2 ways to get it to the user's machine. One way is to install it themselves, as I am showing you here, or you can bypass this step and have your IT administrator pre-install the PowerClient launcher to the end users through the MSI file we provide. So in this case, the PowerClient launcher isn't pre-installed, so I need to install it. Open it. Here I will select multiple users and accept the terms of the license agreement, and click install. The launcher is downloading all my application files from the web server. And it is starting my application. See, here's my app with my windows, my data windows. See this window right here, remember? Let's open it. Products windows as well. Remember the reporting, so here we have it as well. Let's run this. Okay, now let's take a look at what gets downloaded on my client computer. So I have a desktop icon here, which is actually pointing to the launcher, as you can see right here. It is also passing in the URL of the application to download from. This ensures that my app will look for updates every time I run it. This launcher is a generic launcher, and you only need one launcher installed for all of your PowerClient applications. You just pass the URL of the app you want it to download from. Okay, then on this folder are my application files. Well, this one is for this particular demo R3 application. Notice how I have all my application files in folders. And let's go see my individual objects. Okay, now let's go ahead and make a change to my application to see how that gets updated automatically to the final user. Okay, let's go look for a window right here. This one. Okay, let's add a message box right here. Okay, message box. Saved. Changes saved. Save it. Okay, now let's redeploy and see what happens. Okay, let's run this. See, we have right here the message box added. So let's go ahead and deploy a second app. Okay, I'm deploying right here. Okay, now I'll type in the URL of the app. See? It's downloading it. See, it didn't ask me to install the launcher. So, once the launcher is installed, all your other apps come down and run. So, my application is running, and it is working. Okay, now here's a shortcut. It has been created for my second app. Look, it's referring to the same generic launcher right here, and also using the URL for this app. We hope you try out this new R3 feature and learn more on how to use it on Elevate 2020 conference. Okay, Armin, I think it's already time for the Q&A.